Okay, so this video is going to be about something that has been a cornerstone of my practice as a social worker, the idea of externalising. And externalising has become important to me, not just in the counselling work that I've done, but also in community development work, in interactions with my colleagues, interactions with friends and even family members. I think it trickled into every aspect of my life. The point of externalising is to notice how our language can have an impact on others, and how traditionally in Anglo-Australian language we may have used internalising language as a way of actually keeping people in a situation of disadvantage. Now, the challenge I had when I first started learning about externalising and using externalising language was it seemed that people were speaking in gobbledygook or in some kind of foreign secret cult kind of convoluted way. And I'm conscious that the risk is that I do the same thing. So I'm going to try and do it in a non-convoluted way. But that's tricky when you realise how powerful language can be. There's not enough room in this brief snapshot to talk about the power of language, and I'm hoping that there will be a chance for me just to speak directly to you about the power of language, perhaps if not next week, in the following week. But I did want to give an example that I gave my class last week about externalising and the impact it can have on people's understanding of themselves and professionals' understanding of themselves. One of the easiest ways for me to understand externalising is to take myself back to 1991 when I first began doing intensive work-based training about working with people with mental health issues. So I was working in a proclaimed place in King's Cross in New South Wales. Proclaimed places were set up as safe, inviting alternatives to jail cells for people who weren't sober. So prior to the Proclaimed Place Act of, I think, about 1980-82, if someone was intoxicated and picked up on the streets, they had to go to the police, who would book them, that would keep them in the cell overnight until they sobered up and they could go home. And the idea was that kept them safe, and it also kept people perhaps safe from those who are intoxicated. What we learned was that people needed somewhere safe to stay, and that perhaps the jail wasn't the most appropriate place, or the lockout wasn't the most appropriate place. And so proclaimed places were set up in New South Wales for men and for women. And where I worked, there was 32 beds available for women who would come in at any point. They could come in at any point through a 24-hour period if they're intoxicated, and just have a shower, have something to eat, put their clothes in the washing machine and go to sleep. Wake up, have another shower, have something else to eat, get their clothes out of the dryer, get their belongings and go again. And it was vital for the women that I worked with to have that opportunity. Remembering it was 1991, and that was 12 months after the mental health deinstitutionalisation policy had been rolled out across Australia, where the once big mental institutions, mental hospitals, had been dismantled, and people were taken from those hospitals and put into the community, following a policy that had a beautiful ethic at heart, which was that mental illness shouldn't mean that you're locked away, that ideally people with mental illnesses should be part of a community and supported to live in community. The philosophy was a wonderful one. Surprisingly, wow, so surprising, it wasn't actually backed up with financial support from the government. So what happened was the hospitals were dismantled, they were deinstitutionalised. People were moved, shifted out into the community, but they weren't given appropriate support. They weren't given the same sort of support they had once upon a time in the hospitals. So the women I worked with, for example, had been allocated their own housing commission house in, say, Elizabeth or Potts Point or Woolloomooloo, a suburb around King's Cross. Many of these women had been incarcerated in a mental hospital for 20 years of their lives. Now, they've never had to cook. They haven't had to watch their medication. They haven't needed to know what the time is and so what it means to take their medication at a particular time. 1991, it meant that all the women who were in those hospitals had never experienced an automatic teller machine. So they came out and all of a sudden they had to try and negotiate how they got their Centrelink allowance from a hole in the wall. Made no sense to them. So not surprisingly, many of the women I worked with didn't end up taking their medication on time because they weren't used to that. They weren't familiar with them having to do it. There weren't enough community nurses to go around to provide the support for them to do that, let alone all the stuff around budgeting, shopping for food, preparing for food, cooking yourself nutritious meals. What it meant was, of the 32 beds available, at least half of those beds were taken up by women who are now effectively homeless, who were literally living on the streets because their illness was so florid they would completely forget that they had a home, let alone the address of the home, and how to manage. And they were just seeking somewhere safe to lie down and sleep when they needed to sleep, at whatever point in the 24-hour cycle it was. It was then that I learnt the importance of not seeing someone as a schizophrenic. Instead, to acknowledge I was working with a woman who was living with schizophrenia. I had a fantastic supervisor and team leader who supported all of us in changing our language around our assessment and our understanding of people. And back then in 1991, it was quite common to get referrals, for example, from police or from other people who were saying, oh my God, we've picked up a schizophrenic. She's a schizophrenic and she's an alcoholic and we're bringing her in now. And my team leader would say, she's not a schizophrenic. She's not an alcoholic. She's a woman who is dependent on alcohol because life isn't easy, and why wouldn't you be? She also has an illness called schizophrenia. But she's someone's daughter, she's someone's sister, she's possibly someone's partner, she's possibly someone's mother. She's possibly had a career life, she's possibly had a rich personal life. She's so much more than that language. So the idea of externalising is to start to shift our language to make sure we acknowledge that people are more than their problem. That means if someone talks to you about their depression and they might say, I really struggle, I'm bipolar, you might find the way in your language to say something like, so you have a bipolar disorder. What has that meant in your life, the bipolar disorder? Or something else that I've heard women say at times, like, I'm deeply hopeless. I just, I am too easily led and I'm absolutely gullible. So you might say, so there are times when hopelessness is really apparent to you and you feel like gullibility is there. Someone will tell you a story and gullibility has you convinced that that's the right thing. Well, at first it sounds a little bit like a trick of speech that doesn't mean anything. It's really interesting how quite quickly the person you're working with starts to pick up the same language. And you'll see this week there's also that link to Stephen Madigan's interview with young David and his mother. just watch at how he manages to externalize behaviours that start off being described as anxiety and kind of shift to having a mental blank. What do they shift to? I can't think. You'll have to watch. But they manage to together find the right word to externalize what it is. I'm thinking it's something like ragging on each other, but it's not actually that. So it'll come to me. Then you watch it, and you'll know what I mean. Okay, so that's the guts of externalizing language. It's listening for when somebody uses a whole word to describe themselves, or perhaps someone else, or in fact you catch yourself using those words. For example, she's a victim. She's a victim of domestic violence. Well, actually, no. She has experienced domestic violence, and but she's a woman who is married, who might also be a mother, who might also have a whole life ahead of her. Or he's a perpetrator. Well, actually, no. He uses tactics of violence and abuse, and he uses them on his male partner, but in addition to that, there are other parts of his life where he's functioning really well. So how important would it be to grasp those areas of where he is functioning really well and see if he can use those skills and those knowledges to reconnect with ways of behaving that don't involve hurting, abusing or violating someone else's rights. There you go. A snapshot of externalising language. I hope that helps a bit in explaining some of the material. Thanks.